Well, we are continuing our series on Revelation called Revelation, God's Picture Book. And we're chapter by chapter, actually verse by verse, making our way through this study. We're up to lesson number 16 and chapter 17 of Revelation. And I like to do a quick overview of where we've been so far and just to show you the approach that we're taking to go through this book before we get into chapter 17. So let's just begin with a little bit of review. And so the first part here is, if you look at the book of Acts, the way we're doing this, if you can look at the book of Revelation, that is, Revelation can be divided into 4 acts. Each of these acts begin with the curtain drawn to reveal the glory of God. So there's a scene of God's glory in some way. And so in Act 1, you see the glorified Christ. In Act 2, you see the throne room of God. In Act 3, you see a picture of the quote-unquote radiant woman, and then there was a great sign from heaven. And then in Act 4, you see another sign in heaven. Now, these acts, Acts 1, 2, 3, and 4, you won't see that written in the Bible. This is just according to how we're outlining it for the sake of this study. So, what are the different acts in the book of Revelation? So, Act 1 is Revelations 1 through 3, and it's understanding the relationship between Christ and the church, and that's where you see the glorified Christ standing in the middle of the lampstands, representing Jesus in the midst of the church, and then he sends out these letters to churches in Asia Minor with exhortations and also some corrections. And so there is the first act, opening up some communication between the Lord and his church. And then Act 2 is Revelation chapters 4 through 11. And in this, we get a picture of understanding the judgment from God. And so chapters 4 and 5, you got this vision of heaven, and you have a scroll, the 7 seals, and we have the Lamb, who's the only one who can open the scroll with the 7 seals and reveal the message there. Then you have chapter 6, the Lamb opens 6 out of the 7 seals, and you have some messages about the suffering Christian and what we endure as believers. Chapter 7 has an interlude of all of these seals that are being opened, and it's just a vision of heaven. And then chapters 8 and 9, you have the opening of the 7th seal, which introduces another series of 7, which is the 7 trumpets. And then the 7 seals depict the suffering of Christians. The 7 trumpets depict actions from God against the ungodly, the judgment that will come to those who cause the suffering of Christians. And then chapters 10 and 11 contains another interlude providing encouragement for suffering servants. And so in chapter 10, you have this amazing image of John, who's the writer of Revelation. He's handed a small scroll and is told to eat it. The scroll is sweet to the taste, but sour to the stomach. Living the Christian life, there's sweet and sour to it. There's sweetness, there's encouragement, but there's also struggle that we deal with as well. Chapter 11, you have this idea of the holy temple being trampled for 42 months. You see things like 42 months, those types of time designations. You think I just replaced the word 42 months with temporary. These are temporary setbacks for the kingdom of God. And then you have a picture of 2 witnesses that are representing the faithful of the church, and they are put to death, and then they come back after 3.5 days, showing that yes, there is suffering, but it is temporary. So that is Act 2, which brings us to Act 3. And Act 3 gives us some insight into why there is opposition to those who follow Christ, to God and his people. So you have chapter 12, which features a picture of the woman and the dragon, and then you have a background of opposition here. So the woman and the dragon, the woman is representing, and her child are representing Christ and the church, and the dragon is trying to oppose her. And then you have the background story of how the devil came to be and how that happened. So you travel back in time a little bit and get the origin story of the devil. Then you have chapter 13. You have these two beasts, the beast of the sea and the beast of the land. And they work in concert with the great dragon. They're all together, this evil empire, working against God, working against God's people. Chapter 13 is where you get that famous number, 666. So that's where you have that. You can go back into our previous lessons if you want to hear that in detail of what that was all about. Chapter 14, you have a picture of the victory that's experienced by those who overcome, and then the judgment experienced by those who oppose God and his people. You can see this pattern again and again here. This is where in chapter 14 you have this phrase, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. And so we're seeing an introduction of the use of the word Babylon as a symbol of powers in opposition to God and his people. So that is Act 3, understanding why there is opposition. And then we're coming into the final act. We started this a couple weeks ago, last week I should say. So we're in Act 4, and it's understanding God's wrath and God's righteousness. If you remember, one of the illustrations we use to describe the book of Revelation, how it works, Revelation is a lot about repetition. You see the same theme over and over again. The suffering of Christians, it doesn't seem fair, but then God's righteous judgment comes along. You see a picture of heaven and God in all of his glory and his might. You see suffering Christians again. You see what looks like an intimidating beast or intimidating opposition to the Christian faith. And again and again, you see this cycle, but this cycle is heading to a destination. It's not just an endless merry-go-round. It is heading towards a final destination, a final point here. So this is understanding God's wrath and God's righteousness. So chapters 15 and 16 that we looked at last week, we have the sevenfold wrath of God. So what happens in these chapters here? God's wrath is pictured as 7 bowls being poured out by angels onto the wicked, the 7 bowls of wrath. And so one of the things I find interesting here is you have this theme that's repeated over and over in the way that it is worded, showing that, first of all, God's wrath is sure. God's judgment will happen. God's wrath is terrible. You don't want to be on the receiving end of it. There's horrible descriptions of it. But the big part here, too, that it's over and over again, the wrath of God is only for the wicked. God's judgment is always righteous. God is not a cruel judge who just decides he's going to hurt people or something like this. This is only for those who are in constant rebellion, and even in the midst of their judgment and punishment, they are still yelling out blasphemies and still refusing to repent. And so this is the theme here, lest anybody thinks that God is a cruel God or something like this. His wrath is sure, it's terrible, but it is fair. It's only for the wicked here. So I added a little insert into your outline here. You might notice here on your paper there where there's that little box that's right there on your paper. And I came up with this. I've just called this rules of thumb that we've observed so far. So these are unofficial rules of thumb. All right? And this is not exhaustive, but my hope is if you can kind of get your head around this, as you read the book of Revelation, you won't need me to translate it for you or to explain it, that it kind of, as you look at certain things, your mind will go, oh, I see what that means. So let's look at this. Here's some rules of thumb. First of all, things connected to the stuff of God. So, from the chapter 1 on, as you read and you see bright things, flashing things, shining things, loud things, glass, reflective, a throne, smoke, holy, those types of things, you see those types of terms or those images. The idea is your mind is going to go towards, okay, this is connected to the stuff of God. So if when you read through, and maybe even when we read this chapter here tonight, use some of these rules of thumb just to see what do you think this is about. So, on the other hand, things that are connected to the stuff opposed to God. A lot of times a red color, the red dragon, the beastly appearances. You know, you got the 7 heads and the 10 horns. Abyss, that would be associated with the stuff opposed to God. That image, blasphemy, death, those types of things, okay, that's stuff that's opposed to God. You have some different descriptions of God's people. The way I look at it is these are all interchangeable descriptions of God's people. The sealed servants, those who are under the altar, the 144,000, the overcomers, those that are marked by God. You know, we talk about the mark of the beast, there's being marked by God. So these are all terms, or, like for a better way to put it, nicknames for God's people. So you see that, okay, that's God's, that has to do with God's people. Descriptions of those opposed to God and his people. You see that phrase, in the earth, those in the earth, those on the earth, kings of earth, of course, marked by the beast, or worship the beast, or worship the image. Those are descriptions of those who are opposed to God. That's the pictures of the wicked. So have that rule of thumb, and so instead of just pointing at some object and saying, okay, well, that's Russia, or that's whatever it is, instead of saying that, just saying, is that the stuff of God or the stuff opposed to God? Let your mind think in those larger terms, because I think that is what the original writing of this was about, to give us comfort and to give us clarity. So now we're going to use this. We talked last week about Babylon, used as a symbol of a great power opposing the people of God that is doomed to destruction. So chapter 17, verses 1 through 18, as we'll look here, the whole theme of this chapter is the doomed wicked as Babylon. So it's using the city of Babylon, or the nation of Babylon, I should say, as a symbol of those that are doomed, those that are about to be judged. So let's look here, Revelation 17. I think we got time. We'll read the whole chapter, and then we'll go verse by verse. One of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls, those are the 7 bowls of wrath we did last week, came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the punishment of the great prostitute who sits by many waters. With her the kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries." Remember those rules of thumb we talked about earlier? "Then the angel carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness. There I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names, and had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet, and was glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls. She held a golden cup in her hand, filled with abominable things, and the filth of her adulteries. The name written on her forehead was a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and the abominations of the earth." Verse 6, "I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of God's holy people, the blood of those who bore testimony to Jesus. When I saw her, I was greatly astonished. Then the angel said to me, 'Why are you astonished? I will explain to you the mystery of the woman and of the beast she rides, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. The beast which you saw once was, now is not, and yet will come up out of the abyss and to its destruction. The inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world, will be astonished when they see the beast, because it once was, now is not, and yet will come. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. There are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come. But when he does come, he must remain only for a little while. The beast, who once was and now is not, is an 8th king. He belongs to the 7 and is going to his destruction. The 10 horns you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but who for 1 hour will receive authority as kings along with the beast. They have one purpose and will give their power and authority to the beast. They will wage war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will triumph over them, because he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and with him will be his called, chosen, and faithful followers. Then the angel said to me, the waters you saw, where the prostitute sits, are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. The beast and the 10 horns you saw will hate the prostitute. They will bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to accomplish his purpose by agreeing to hand over to the beast their royal authority until God's words are fulfilled. The woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth. All right. I always say, what do we make of all that? All right, you got all these pictures here. So, first of all, the term Babylon. The term Babylon is sometimes or oftentimes used in Scripture as a symbol of a seemingly overwhelming power causing harm to the people of God. They were the ones that captured the Israelites, took them into exile. That just had to be completely defeating and demoralizing to them. And so you say Babylon, and those are the pictures that come to somebody's mind in these days, in biblical times. And so in this chapter, we're going to gain a view of, quote-unquote, Babylon and the judgment that she must endure. So this is all an image. It's God's picture book. So we're looking at this as a picture. So let's look at Babylon, first of all, viewed from God's vantage point, showing that God is just. So verse 1. One of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, come, I will show you the punishment of the great prostitute who sits by many waters. The 7 bowls were the 7 bowls of wrath that we looked at last week from the angels. So we have here a description in this verse of the great prostitute. So Babylon is described figuratively as a great prostitute. In other words, worthy of judgment. So these are terms showing, okay, this is something that is worthy of judgment. And she sits by many waters. Now, eventually we find out that this phrase, the many waters, is actually referring to people. We read that in verse 15. It's also good to note that physical Babylon was located on the great water of the Euphrates. And so all of this imagery here, this is God's picture book. We've got a picture of the great prostitute, Babylon. We give nations sometimes nicknames and things. And so here you have this. Babylon is called the great prostitute here in this context. So this brings us to verse 2. With her, the kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries. You remember those rules of thumb, the kings of the earth, inhabitants of the earth. You know who those people are. So it's a description of those who are in rebellion against God. So my hope is that maybe by now, as you're reading that, your mind is like, oh, okay, these are people opposed to God. Okay, these aren't the saints. These aren't the saints under the altar. These are the people that are opposing God. And so what did they do? They drank the wine and were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries. So the Bible often uses this symbolic imagery of adultery to describe people rejecting the one true God and worshiping false gods. Interesting, when God gave the commandment, don't worship other gods, he said, I am a jealous God. I noted Hosea chapter 1 and verse 2. It's actually the second part of that verse. Here's a description that God used of his people because they were worshiping false gods. He says, for like an adulterous wife, this land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord. And so going back to Revelation, you have this imagery again. This is a common Bible tool used to describe people being unfaithful to God. So this brings us to verse 3. Then the angel carried me away in the Spirit into a wilderness. There I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. Now, using some of the tools that we have been using so far, we can figure out a little bit about who is this character that we're seeing. So, first of all, we have that phrase, in the Spirit and in a wilderness here. It's another reminder of John's circumstance. You might remember earlier, John said, I was in the Spirit. And he's seeing these visions. He's given a glimpse of the spiritual reality. He's also in a wilderness. We're reminded he is exiled in Patmos. So he's in the wilderness, in the Spirit. He's seeing all this stuff. This is how he's witnessing these things. So here is the question here. This woman. There was a woman earlier, in the earlier chapters, with her son that was being attacked by the dragon. Remember that? Now, those were the good guys, not the dragon, the woman and the child, okay? But here we have another woman. You think, oh, well, maybe this is a good person again. Maybe they're on the good side here. So what are the clues that tell us? Is she good or bad? Well, she's on a scarlet beast in the blasphemous names. So, here's your sign. here's your clue there, all right? He's on that scarlet beast. That red color seems to be generally used to describe things in opposition to God. And then you have the 7 heads and the 10 horns. And think about it this way. You call it the 7 heads, 10 horns kind of beast. It's just like the beast that were described in Revelation 12:3 and Revelation 13:1. I'll just read this here in 12:3. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, 7 crowns on its head. 13:1. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns. And so you have this imagery of the 7 heads and 10 horns. It's the 7-head, 10-horn kind. So it is to be associated with the enemies of God. So here's this woman. That's the picture. This is why we call it God's picture book. You got this image in your head of what this woman is about. So, call the next phrase here, seeing through her sham. Now, those rules of thumb, what were some of the things that you would say that would be associated with God? Bright, golden, reflective, shiny. Well, she has some shiny stuff. So let's look here. Verse 4. Here's this woman with some shiny stuff. What is this having to say? This woman was dressed in purple and scarlet and was glittering. That's shiny, right? With gold, precious stones, and pearls. She had a golden cup in her hand, filled with abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. Well, that's quite an image there, isn't it? So, she had this appearance of royalty. Purple, scarlet, gold, precious stones, pearls. the golden cup. I think as much as you have to pay, I don't really go to Starbucks, but much you have to pay for Starbucks, they ought to give you a golden cup with that. But the golden cup, you have this appearance of, oh, she's got it going on. She's sparkly and shiny. She's got royalty colors, but a closer look, some might look and say, well, this is someone to be followed. But a closer look reveals the true character. The cup is filled with the filth of her adulteries. So the outside is golden, everything's shiny, but the contents are revealing here. So we're getting the picture. And so, see, we're interpreting this ourselves. We're doing this together here. All right, verse 5. The name written on her forehead was a mystery. Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth. Okay, so this can be misconstrued a little bit here. The name written on her forehead was a mystery. That word mystery there is used many times in the Bible to denote something that God has revealed. You could almost put the term, the name written on her forehead was a revealed mystery. So it's a revealed truth or a revealed mystery. And so I want to emphasize this, have you write this down in the line there. There is no puzzle in this title. So when you see this, when they say, well, this is a mystery, sometimes people just want to go just like Nicolas Cage in that book, that one movie, National Treasure, where he's deciphering all these codes. This is not our cue to go decipher this code. It's a revealed mystery. It's telling you what it is. So there is no puzzle in this title. It reveals the sinful nature of this woman, quote unquote, and all that she stands for. So that brings us to the next part here in verse 6. I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of God's holy people, the blood of those who bore testimony to Jesus. When I saw her, I was greatly astonished. So adding to the picture here, this is becoming pretty clear what this is about. Drunk with the blood of God's holy people. She is taking pleasure in bringing hardship, persecution, and death. And so can you see where this could be a reality of the people in the day, in these days, in biblical times, undergoing Roman persecution? Can you see this? Were there Roman soldiers that took some pleasure in causing pain for Christians? And perhaps other groups, some of the Jewish leaders that were wanting to oppose, who were threatened, their leadership was threatened by the rise of Christianity. So there's that sign. And so then you have God's holy people, that is meaning saints. Now in the Catholic tradition, to be a saint, there is a whole process that one goes through in all of this. But the truth is, in biblical terms and technical terms, a saint is just simply God's holy people. So you are saints right now. Some of you are more saintly than others, as I'm looking. No, I'm just kidding here. But you are saints. It just means God's set apart people. And in those who bore testimony, and he's referring to those who have died because of their faith. These are the slain saints under the altar that were referred to back in chapter 6. And so John says, I was astonished by this, deeply impacted from the realization of what he was seeing here. So there's verse 6, brings us up to verse 7. Then the angel said to me, why are you astonished? I will explain to you the mystery of the woman and of the beast she rides, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. That beast is the 7-head, 10-horn kind, right? Remember? All right, so this was not really a rebuke of John. It's just simply the angel confirming and giving further explanation of what he was witnessing. Here you've got the woman and the beast she rides. Here is one thing to remember. The woman and the beast, these two are the same kind. That's a word that I find myself, well, in the commentary I'm going through, that's used quite a bit. It's the 10 horns, it's the 7-head, 10-horn kind. It's the beastly kind. It's the 42-month kind. And you can associate which of these different things, what's supposed to be meant by these, by associating what kind of thing or person is this. So this brings us to verse number 8. The beast which you saw once was, now is not, and yet will come, but up out of the abyss and go to its destruction. The inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written on the book of life from the creation of the world, will be astonished when they see the beast, because it once was, now is not, and yet will come. So, we have a little bit of a play on words here. The beast once was, now is not, yet will come, as opposed to the Lord who was and is to come. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. And we'll explain what is kind of meant by this play on words here. Now, when we see the beast coming out of the abyss, remember, the abyss is the place of judgment. And so if they're coming out of the abyss, that's where that beast belongs. That's shadowing what's going to be happening. And where's it says, come up out of the abyss and go to its destruction. So nothing could be more doomed than this actor in this play that we're watching right now. It's the doomed kind. It's in opposition or in contrast to the one who was and is to come. And so then we have the inhabitants of the earth. We know who those guys are. Will be astonished. So the beast impresses and deceives these people who rebel against God. And so for a while they're impressed. They are following after this and are deceived here. And again, what's another description here? Their names have not been written in the book of life, and it's just a further description of the character of these rebellious people. You could add that to the list of titles for rebellious people: those of the earth, the kings of the earth, those in the earth, marked by the beast, not written in the Lamb's book of life. So it's just that list of names you can go on here. So what do we make of this? There's a reason that we get to see this. The viewer profits from the vision here. So using the outline I've come across here, verses 9 and 10. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. There are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, one is, the other has not yet come. But when he does come, he must remain only for a little while. So, we're going to use this phrase again here. The 7 heads, the 7 hills, the 7 kings. It's all the same stuff. These are all the same kind. All these oppositions, all these things that rise up, all these things that come up, they're all the same thing. They can all be put into the same category. And so it's I think it's important that we're careful not to get lost in the details and in the equivalence of these things. We're looking for the common elements. They're all the same kind. They're all doomed. There's 7 kings, the 7 beasts, the 7 heads, all of these things. And so, what does it say again? They have fallen. He must remain only for a little while. Have you seen this theme before in Revelation? This is the opposition for God is temporary. It's temporary suffering or it's temporary persecution. So you've got this picture. Just look at it as a big picture here. And so then this brings us to this phrase we keep seeing here: the beast, who once was and now is not, and now is an 8th king. He belongs to the 7 and is going to their destruction. And so they're all the same kind, all of this that you see. So, was and is not. And so, what this is saying, this beast is a has-been. You can put it that way. This beast is a has-been. Where in contrast, the Lamb, the one who is, was, and is to come, that's the Lamb. And so then you have, he belongs to the seven. They're all the same. They're all put in there together. Belongs to the seven and is going to his destruction. And so the end result is the main focus here. What is the end result of all of these things? All of these opposers of God. What's the focus? They're going to their destruction. That's what's going to happen. You can rest assured they are doomed here. So now, verse 12 and 13, the 10 horns you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but for 1 hour will receive authority as kings along with the beast. They have one purpose and will give their power and authority to the beast. A couple phrases here. They've not yet received a kingdom. They seem to have credentials of kings, but in reality they really don't have authority. And then you have the 1 hour kind. What do you think that means? Well, some translations, some of your translations might say the 1 day. But any authority they have is temporary. It's just, okay, it seems like they got power, but it's not forever, it's temporary. These kings seem intimidating. The beast seems intimidating. But in light of God's ultimate power, ultimately, they're all just laughable. So this is what we're getting at here. Verse 14, they will wage war against the Lamb. All right, they're all gathered together to try to wage war, but the Lamb will triumph over them because he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and with him will be called his chosen and faithful followers here. So we'll summarize this here. We have the threat, the attractive, glittery, I'll say, but deceitful woman, the prostitute, the 7-headed, 10-horned dragon, and all those who have been involved with the prostitute unite to show the kind of opposition that Christians face. You have all of this picture here, this big ball of opposition together. That's the threat. Here's the reality. The Lamb of God triumphs over it all. So no matter what you're facing, no matter how intimidating it seems, no matter what empire of evil or what conglomerate comes together to oppose the people of God, the Lamb of God triumphs over them all. So those who follow the Lamb share in his victory there. So that is the reality. So when we see things, why is this important to us? Why is this helpful? When we see things from God's vantage point, we know that the war is over. The war is over. The war is over. The war is... Okay, there you go. Hello, YouTube, or whatever it is. Hello, blooper reel. The war is over. The victory is won. So that's easy for me to say there. So, all right. Well, there we go. There's a good blooper for the time. So, all right. Verse 15 and 16. Then the angel said to me, the waters you saw where the prostitute sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. The beast and the 10 horns you saw will hate the prostitute. They will bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. Wow, this is a beautiful sight we got here. There are some more encouraging passages in Revelation, just so you know. Okay, so what's the picture here? They will hate the prostitute and bring her to ruin. So it's kind of interesting. Those who have followed this woman, those who have wooed this woman for their own selfish interest, now have turned on her. Isn't that interesting? So they're kind of consuming themselves here. Isn't it so interesting that a lot of times those who rise to power, they'll be followed by some people with their own self-interest, and those people turn on the person that's a big leader, seems so influential. So this is an interesting passage here, verse 17. For God has put it into their hearts to accomplish his purpose by agreeing to hand over to the beast their royal authority until God's words are fulfilled. So what in the world does this mean here? So God has put it into their heart. This is a picture of God's providence at work when he executes his judgment. There were various times, if you remember our study going through the Old Testament, there are various times in history where God used a pagan nation to bring judgment to Israel. Maybe you remember when we did a study on the book of Habakkuk. In the study of the book of Habakkuk, it's all written where God's saying, Habakkuk is lamenting how people are turning from God in Israel. And then God says, well, I'm going to handle this, and you're not going to believe what I'm going to do. And Habakkuk, what are you going to do? Well, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to raise up the Babylonians, this evil group, and they are going to be what I use to come in and bring judgment on the people of God. And Habakkuk's like, are you kidding me? I'm paraphrasing. What do you mean? You mean you're going to, those evil people, anybody but them, but this was God's providence. A lot of times God would cause a pagan nation to come in and cause destruction. Same thing is happening here. God has put it into their hearts to accomplish his purpose. It doesn't mean that they are in his will. He's talking about evil people. They're turning on each other. In his providence, he is causing judgment among the wicked, and sometimes he even uses the wicked to, in his providence, to cause judgment upon them. So, verse 18, the woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth. So, again, this is a very cheery chapter here, but we got to make our way through it before we see the final glory of heaven and things. So whether we are seeing the woman, the prostitute, the great city, Babylon, they're all alike. They bring the 1 day or the 1 year type of suffering, no matter what your translation says there, for the righteous. But this does not compare to the complete and eternal judgment that they will meet one day. And so this is a chapter simply about having the right perspective. Yes, the enemies we face as Christians are intimidating and terrible and awful and seemingly overwhelming, but the Lamb triumphs over it all. And it seems like the other thing about the enemy, it seems like the enemy just keeps regrouping and coming back, but the Lamb triumphs over them all. And it seems like Christians are way outnumbered, but the Lamb triumphs over them all. And so that is the message of Revelation chapter 17, and we have just a very few chapters left, and we are going to get to the end of this. I'm very much looking forward to this. I hope you found some encouragement in this, and we'll look forward to the next week.